It all started innocently enough. My daughter Anya had just turned 8, and we decided to buy her something special, a porcelain doll. It was a beautiful, handcrafted piece, with delicate features and eyes so blue they almost seemed alive. Anya named her Eliza and took to her immediately, like most young girls do with their dolls. At first I thought nothing of it. Anya would spend hours talking to Eliza, brushing her hair and carrying her everywhere. It was cute, endearing even, to see her so attached. But as the days wore on, I began to notice small, unsettling things, little details that didn't add up. It started with the whispers. Anya would wake in the middle of the night, crying about strange voices she heard. I'd sit with her, calm her down, and assure her it was just a bad dream. But deep down, something gnawed at me. My wife, Mary, dismissed it easily, thinking it was just the vivid imagination of a child. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then, one night, I heard it myself. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but there was no mistaking it. Whispers coming from Anya's room. I crept down the hallway, heart pounding, ears straining to catch the sound. My hand hovered over the doorknob as the whispers stopped. Silence filled the air, as thick and suffocating as a shroud. I opened the door slowly, finding Anya asleep, clutching Eliza tightly against her chest. Everything seemed fine, and yet I couldn't shake the unease creeping through me. I watched them for a while longer, half expecting something to happen, but nothing did. I told myself it was my imagination, that perhaps I was just overtired, overworked. But the next morning, as I sipped my coffee, Anya looked up from her breakfast and said, almost casually, "Daddy, Eliza talks to me at night." I froze. I tried to smile, to play it off, but my voice betrayed my unease. "What does she say, sweetheart?" "She says she's lonely," Anya replied, her eyes wide and innocent. "She doesn't like being left alone in the dark." I exchanged a glance with Mary, but she just shrugged it off. "Kids and their imaginations," she said, as though that explained everything. But something was off. I could feel it. Anya's voice, the way she said it, wasn't normal. That night, I kept my door ajar, listening. The whispers returned, and this time they were louder, more distinct. I could make out words, faint and fragmented. I bolted upright, my pulse hammering in my ears. It was coming from Anya's room again. My feet hit the cold floor as I moved toward the door. When I stepped into her room, the temperature dropped instantly, an icy chill enveloping me. Anya lay still, her breathing soft and even. But the doll, Eliza, was sitting upright at the foot of her bed, its piercing blue eyes fixed on me. My blood ran cold. I was certain I had tucked the doll into its miniature bed by the window. I stared at it, frozen, feeling as though the room itself was watching me, waiting. I moved toward Eliza, hesitated, then grabbed her and set her back where she belonged. It felt ridiculous, but I didn't sleep that night. Over the next few days, things escalated. Objects began to move. Anya's toys appeared in strange places. Doors creaked open and shut by themselves. And then there were the whispers, growing louder, more insistent. Anya seemed to grow paler, quieter, as though something was draining the life from her. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to do something. Desperate, I called in a priest. Father Bennett arrived late in the afternoon, a quiet, kind man who had clearly seen his share of strange happenings. He walked through the house, his eyes narrowed, as he felt something unseen. When he reached Anya's room, he stopped. His gaze landed on Eliza, and he frowned. "The doll," he said simply. "There's something wrong with it." I nodded, my heart pounding as he unpacked a small vial of holy water and a cross. He began the ritual, speaking in low, rhythmic Latin. The air grew thick, and the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath hung in the air, visible in the freezing cold. Then, suddenly, the doll moved. Eliza's head twisted slowly, her glassy eyes locking onto the priest. Her mouth opened, a guttural growl emerging from deep within. I stumbled backward, horrified, as the doll's once innocent face contorted into a grotesque mask of rage. "She's mine," the voice hissed, though the lips didn't move. The sound filled the room, vibrating in the very walls. The priest didn't falter. He continued his incantation, louder, more forceful, commanding the entity to leave. Eliza's porcelain face cracked, her body shuddering violently. A sharp wind whipped through the room, though the windows were closed. I watched in horror as the doll's tiny hands clawed at the air, fighting against some invisible force. And then, with a sickening crack, the doll's head snapped backward, its body falling limp to the floor. For a moment, everything was still. The whispers ceased. The room was deathly quiet. Father Bennett breathed heavily, beads of sweat forming on his brow. He knelt down, scooping up the shattered pieces of the doll, his hands trembling slightly. "It's over," he said, but his voice held no certainty. Anya stirred, waking slowly from what felt like a trance. She blinked, disoriented, then smiled up at me. "Daddy?" I nodded, relief flooding through me as I held her close. But as I glanced down at the broken doll on the floor, something inside me whispered that it wasn't truly over. It never would be. I've been driving trucks for over a decade, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the open road can play tricks on you, especially on those long stretches of highway where the desert sprawls out like an endless sea, and the heat shimmers in waves off the asphalt. But this wasn't a trick. It was a moonless night, the kind that swallows the stars whole and leaves nothing but a void. I had been driving for hours, eyes heavy with fatigue. The radio wasn't doing much to keep me awake anymore, and my thoughts drifted aimlessly with each passing mile. I was just starting to think about pulling off at the next rest stop when I saw her, a woman, standing on the side of the road, thumb outstretched, dressed in white. Her long dark hair moved gently in the breeze, and even from a distance I could see she didn't belong out here, not on this barren stretch of highway. I had heard the stories, phantom hitchhikers, restless spirits, the kind of tales truckers swap over bad coffee at roadside diners. But when I saw her up close, those legends didn't matter. She looked real, scared, vulnerable. Something tugged at my gut, and against my better judgment, I pulled over. As my headlights washed over her, I could see the delicate lines of her face, pale and beautiful, her eyes wide and full of something I couldn't quite place. Fear, relief. "Thanks for stopping," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "I've been stranded out here for hours. My car broke down miles back." Her name was Sarah. She told me as much when she climbed into the cab of my truck, glancing over her shoulder as if she half expected someone, or something, to come creeping out of the desert after her. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to make small talk as the road stretched ahead of us again, endless and dark. "There's a farmhouse just up the road a bit," she said. "My aunt lives there. You can drop me off there. I'll be fine." I didn't know how anyone could be fine out here. I'd driven this route more times than I could count, and there were no farmhouses, not for miles. But I didn't press. She seemed fragile, like she'd been through enough already. We talked as I drove. She told me she wanted to be a writer, how she loved the freedom of the open road. Her words flowed like music. And for a while, I forgot about the strangeness of it all, the isolation, the shadows, She was bright, full of life, and for the first time in years I felt like I wasn't alone. But that didn't last. As we neared the turnoff, she mentioned, the air inside the cab grew colder, unnaturally cold. My hands tightened on the wheel as I glanced at her, but she didn't seem to notice. She pointed to a narrow dirt road barely visible in the night. "Just up there," she said, her voice suddenly distant, as if it were coming from far away. I hesitated but turned onto the road, my headlights cutting through the thick darkness. After a mile or so, she asked me to stop. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you, Jack," she said, her hand brushing my arm as she climbed out of the truck. "I won't forget this." Then she was gone, her white dress disappearing into the shadows. I sat there for a few minutes, staring into the blackness where she had vanished. Something wasn't right. The cold that had filled the cab lingered, and an uneasy feeling gnawed at the back of my mind. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to drive back the next day, maybe to make sure she was okay. When I found the turnoff again, the dirt road looked different in the daylight, older, more overgrown. I drove down it, half expecting to see Sarah walking along the side, but there was no sign of her. Then I saw the farmhouse, if you could even call it that. It was barely standing, its roof sagging, windows shattered, the wood dark with rot. It hadn't been lived in for years, decades maybe. My heart pounded as I stepped out of the truck. I approached the house, but every instinct screamed at me to turn back. Still, I knocked on the door, hoping, praying, that someone, anyone, would answer. Nothing. Just the eerie silence of the desert. I drove to a nearby gas station, hoping to shake off the unease that clung to me like a shadow. When I mentioned the farmhouse and Sarah, the old man behind the counter froze. His face went pale. "That farmhouse," he said, his voice trembling. "It's been abandoned since the 70s. No one's lived there since, well, since Sarah." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "Sarah was found dead near that road," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "Car accident. Her car broke down, and she tried to hitchhike back to town. Never made it. They found her body a week later, just a few miles from that old farmhouse." I didn't believe him. I couldn't. But the way his voice shook, the way the color had drained from his face, I knew he wasn't lying. I left the station without another word, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. As I pulled back onto the highway, I glanced into the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw her. Sarah, sitting in the passenger seat, her eyes dark, empty, staring right at me. And then, she was gone. The miles stretch out before me now, just as they did that night. But the road isn't the same anymore. I'm not the same, because now I know what's out there. It started when we moved into the Harper mansion, a grand, crumbling Victorian perched on a cliff, staring down at the ocean like an old sentinel. From the first moment we stepped inside, the place felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy, like the house had been holding its breath for years, waiting for someone to break the silence. My wife thought it was the charm of the place, its age giving it character. Our daughter, Emily, seemed to love it too. But I knew better. Something in that house didn't want us there. We got it for a steal. The realtor had glossed over why the previous owners left so abruptly, and in my gut, I knew we should have asked more questions. But the mansion had been an irresistible opportunity, too good to pass up. I told myself, the noises, the cold spots, were just the quirks of an old house. Every evening the wind howled through the cracks, and I would lie in bed, listening to the creaking floors above us, convincing myself it was nothing. It wasn't long before Emily saw it first. She came running down from her room one night, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. "There's someone in the house," she screamed, clutching at her mother's arm. I could see she was trembling, tears welling in her eyes. My wife and I tried to calm her down, thinking she must have been dreaming, but Emily's fear was too real, too raw to ignore. She told us about a shadow in the doorway, taller than any person she had ever seen, its eyes glowing red like hot coals. I wanted to believe it was just her imagination. Kids see things in the dark. But the way she described it, the way her voice quivered when she spoke, made me shiver. The next few nights, the noises got worse. Soft footsteps above us when no one was there. Objects would disappear, only to reappear in places they couldn't possibly be. I told myself it was all in my head, but it wasn't. And when the door to the attic started slamming shut on its own, I finally admitted it. We weren't alone in that house. One night, while we were having dinner, the lights flickered and went out. Darkness swallowed the room, leaving us with just the faint glow from the fireplace. It was then that I saw it, the shadow Emily had described, standing in the corner of the room, motionless, watching us. Its eyes burned like embers, and a cold wind seemed to flow from it, chilling the air. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for a candlestick, holding it like a weapon, as if that could protect us. The shadow moved toward us, its form shifting and twisting like smoke. I could hear a low, guttural whisper, but I couldn't make out the words. My wife screamed. Emily buried her face in her hands, and I could only stand there, paralyzed by fear. The lights flickered back on, and just like that, the shadow was gone. I knew then that we were in deep trouble. This wasn't some harmless haunting. This thing, whatever it was, wanted us gone, or worse. We called a team of paranormal investigators, hoping they could rid us of the entity. They came with all their equipment, EMF meters, EVP recorders, the works, and immediately felt the presence in the house. "There's something dark here," one of them said, a thin woman with sharp eyes and a voice like gravel. "This isn't a normal haunting." As they explored the house, the investigators uncovered the mansion's grim history. The previous owners hadn't just left because of strange occurrences. They had fled in terror after their daughter vanished from her room one night. The locals had long whispered about the house, saying it was cursed. Built by a man named Charles Harper, who had been obsessed with the occult, the mansion had seen tragedy after tragedy. Harper's wife had died under mysterious circumstances, and his children had all gone missing one by one, their bodies never found. As the investigators worked, they recorded something, an EVP, a voice faint but clear. "It's still here," it whispered, sending a chill down my spine. The lead investigator looked at me, her face pale. "This thing, it's not a spirit. It's something much older, much darker." That night, the mansion seemed to come alive. The walls groaned, doors slammed shut on their own, and a freezing cold settled over the house. Emily screamed again, and when I rushed into her room, I saw the shadow standing at the foot of her bed, its eyes glowing, brighter than before. I grabbed her, pulling her close as the air seemed to thicken, suffocating us. I could hear whispers, low, indistinct, but growing louder, closer. We had to leave. I didn't care about the house anymore. I didn't care about the money we'd poured into it. We just needed to get out. But the shadow wasn't going to let us go that easily. As we rushed down the stairs, it followed us, its dark form looming over us, growing larger, more menacing. The front door slammed shut before we could reach it, and I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, pulling me back. I fought against it, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. In that moment, I knew. We weren't just being haunted, we were being hunted. The shadow wasn't trying to scare us away. It wanted something more, something it had taken before, and it wouldn't stop until it had us.